It is an absolute honor to join you all, and several hard acts to follow. I also was quite touched by some of the contributions we've already had today, and I think quite a lot of the themes will continue throughout what I'm hoping to share with you now, as far as looking at the effects of exploitation, the effects of trauma, what we're seeing across the UK, and just to echo what Emma was just saying, how just on our toes we need to be to spot those indicators and intervene in a timely and victim-centered manner. So I'd like to start with you today, first looking at just what is modern slavery. So I'm here to talk to you about modern slavery and exploitation, and really first want to look at what does that even mean? What do we mean when we say modern slavery to begin with? So right off the bat, modern slavery is just the illegal basic trade in individuals. It is making someone work or provide services. Excuse me. Let's see, I just need to change my display, I think. Here we go. It's making someone work or provide services for someone else's gain. So, of course, someone in a situation is not paid properly. They have very little control over their circumstances, and ultimately, and very importantly, they don't feel free to leave. And so you might wonder, well, how does someone keep someone in that situation? And wasn't this outlawed long ago? Indeed, of course, it is definitely illegal. It has been for some time. But unfortunately, this is looked at as one of the third largest international transnational crimes right now, just after arms and drug trade. When we look at the UK, there's varying different estimates. Some estimate as much as 100,000 victims of modern slavery are present in the UK at any one time. This is often looked at as an invisible crime, so to be honest, it's a little bit difficult to get really good data. But we know it's quite prevalent. So I want to go through the different types of exploitation we're seeing, some of the indicators of that, and then, as I mentioned, we'll move on to the trauma. So one key thing that we want to ask is, or think about, is whether someone feels free to leave what they're being made to do, whether they're being made to provide labor or sexual services. And oftentimes, individuals are under control, but it's an invisible type of control. So sometimes we see those images of chains and links, and we might think actually of images where they're locked away in a dungeon. And unfortunately, individuals are locked in basements, and they are made to live in really unfortunate situations. However, most of the methods of control we see these days are invisible, and it's a lot of psychological chains. So here are some of the most common forms of control we see today that keep people in situations of modern slavery and exploitation. Debt bondage is that situation in which someone might have been paid to have their travel, for example, paid, or their ticket to come to the UK if they're not from the UK originally, and then maybe even accommodation was promised with their job, and then beyond that, maybe a ride, and maybe even food was taken care of, and it sounds like a great package deal and a great job. However, then they realize that perhaps their wages aren't quite what they expected, and the rent and transportation and food is all deducted, unfortunately, from their wages. They didn't appreciate that. And of course, the math is quite skewy, and it just so happens that no matter how many hours someone works at the rate they're being paid, there's no way they're going to pay off the debt of their original ticket or the cost, allegedly, of their ongoing room and board. So debt bondage can be a situation that keeps individuals working where they feel that they can't afford to leave. Of course, we also get physical violence or threats of violence, either against the victim themselves or loved ones. Sexual violence is another way that we see that's often used to manipulate individuals and keep them quiet, submissive, and to assert dominance. We see lots of emotional manipulation. We'll talk a little bit about recruitment, but sometimes we see where loved ones might purport to be a romantic partner and then later betray that individual. And that can cause quite a lot of impact of trauma as well. There can be trauma bonding and confusion and betrayal when someone suddenly then begins to get them to do things that they might not want to do for their gain. I've already mentioned threat to loved ones. Isolation is interesting because, yes, it can be through confinement and restricted movement where you're locked away somewhere, but isolation can also be from moving people around quite often. So sometimes organized crime rings will move people maybe from one car wash for a month to the next for a month to the next for a month. And if you're moving quickly, you never really get to know your community, or where's the closest police office, or where's the local authority's office. And so that constant movement in that organized fashion can often leave individuals feeling quite isolated. And then we see confiscation of documents. Generally, if anybody ever were to present and say they weren't in control of their ID documents, that sends up lots of red flags for us right away that something's not quite right. So on to the different types of exploitation. These are the 4 most common that we see in the UK. As a side note, organ harvesting is also considered part of modern slavery and is also illegal. But these are the 4 most common: labor exploitation, domestic servitude, sexual exploitation, and criminal exploitation. Consistently, we see labor exploitation to be reported and recorded the most, both on the helpline and in government statistics. But we definitely are seeing quite an increase recently in criminal exploitation, which I'll touch on and we'll hear more about this afternoon as well. So now I thought it would be helpful to kind of describe each of those types of exploitation and offer a few signs that you might see in your personal or professional capacities. So first, with labor exploitation, there's several different ways you can identify it. These are some common indicators. There's not kind of one determinative factor, if you will, but some indicators you'll see are whether if someone has inadequate working equipment, they're often working really long hours. They might be transported to and from work. So scenario from that debt bonded situation where transportation and room and tight accommodation, where the accommodation is provided from their employer, they might be taken to work at 7 a.m. and brought home at midnight and paid below minimum wage. And so they're toiling really long hours, but are not able to pay off that debt, for example. And then in addition to the debt bondage, we see lots of different other control methods as well. Ultimately, we need some form of control at play. So it doesn't have to be one of these necessarily, and that will result in the victim not feeling like they're able to leave freely. These are some of the common sectors we've seen labor exploitation in across the UK. Again, we're seeing it everywhere. So I feel like there's quite a lot of awareness recently around nail bars and car washes, and those are 2 common venues. But we're seeing it in other areas with varying levels of education as well. So there's not kind of one sector only that we need to be worried about, unfortunately. Specifically on the helpline, we've seen recently an increase in logistics. So we've got lorry drivers calling us and telling us about their pay structure, and the fact actually that they're not able to pay for their vehicle to keep it safe, and they're not paid properly for their hours. Hospitality would include restaurants as well as hotels, but we're seeing more and more in takeaways. So you kind of your common around local around the corner takeaway we're getting more and more calls about that sort of situation. And then the care sector, I think, is interesting, and this is continuing to grow. So individuals that would be perhaps finding work through an agency, excuse me, or placed in a residential facility, or perhaps going in and providing care in residences through an agency, but the people using that agency to procure that labor don't realize that the agency's not passing on the full wage to the workers. So oftentimes we have very educated, individuals in the medical profession who are calling us and saying that actually they're not getting paid properly, and they're working for a month without a day off, 7 days a week on end, and they're just being moved between facility, and sometimes it's not detected that they're not getting breaks, and their living accommodation is not up to par. When we look at domestic servitude, this is viewed to be one of the most isolated forms of exploitation because it's usually only one victim in a situation, and it's in a private residence. So there's fewer access points from the public to identify a particular victim in domestic servitude. Generally, this scenario is someone who's providing domestic work that could be caring for the children or doing the cooking and cleaning in a residence, but they're not able to come and go as they wish. They're usually often monitored. There's usually a very close relationship between the employee and the employer because they're all living in the same house. And ultimately, at its core, it can be very dehumanizing. Any form of exploitation can be, but this one in particular, it's oftentimes quite stark because they will not be treated like a member of the family. Oftentimes their living accommodations, it will not be that they have their own room. They're often made to sleep on the floor, perhaps in the utilities room or with the children. We've had pretty intense reports about individuals not allowed to eat proper food or fresh food. They can only eat the leftovers, the scraps from the family's plates. Sometimes they're even referred to with derogatory names, such as called slave, and they're told to call the employer a master. Oftentimes their documents are confiscated. And it can also be the case that sexual abuse within the house is used as another way to keep them in their control, to assert dominance, and keep them working there and not saying anything to anyone. And again, they have fewer opportunities to really share their experience when they're kept under close watch in the home. Another common form of exploitation is criminal exploitation. We're seeing this on the rise, frankly, in the UK year on year recently. And this might be a little bit of a surprise to some of you if you're not as familiar with modern slavery. And I think it can be one of the harder ones to detect, because oftentimes in this situation, we see that victims are sometimes first assumed to be criminals and assumed to be the culprit of a situation when that's not actually the case. So much like labor and sexual and domestic servitude, a similar form of control will be at play. It's just that the activity these individuals are being made to do happen to be criminal activities. And actually that brings its whole other layer of control, because the exploiters can use that against the victim and say, well, now you've done something illegal, and if you get caught, you're going to go to prison, and we're not going to help you, and you better not say anything. But in reality, those victims aren't choosing the activities they want to do. They're not keeping the money from the criminal enterprise. It can be very vicious. There can be much violence. And some of the more common crimes that we see involved in this sort of exploitation is drug trafficking, which is often called county lines. And we're going to hear quite a lot about that this afternoon, so I won't go too much into that. We're going to hear some great content, I know. We also see forced begging, cannabis cultivation, where individuals are often locked, sometimes in an apartment in a residential area, or recently, or a few years ago, actually, there was a story about individuals being in an underground bunker, and that was pretty intense. And it was this massive bunker, and there were yards and yards of cannabis plants, and they were not allowed above ground, and they eat frozen pizzas basically, and they're told to turn on and off and water the plants. They don't know where they are, and it can be incredibly, of course, dangerous and difficult for the victim. But it's important to know that there are oftentimes victims there, and so when police go in and find these locations, they might not be there taking care of the plants by choice. We're also seeing more and more money laundering and benefits fraud, where individuals are kind of taking someone's identity or forcing them to use their own personal bank account to move criminal funds. And then lastly, sexual exploitation. So I would assume most of us are a little bit more familiar with this. I think here, what I'd really like to stress is that when people think of sexual exploitation, I think sometimes they think of, as I mentioned before, maybe someone being locked in a brothel that has a facade as a massage parlor, and they're being made to offer sexual services. That definitely happens, but I think it's really important to know that that's more rare. Instead, we see a lot of sexual exploitation happening in residences, in pretty high-end apartment flats. And so the situation might be that they're advertised online, and someone is controlling them, maybe even through a mobile device, telling them where to go or escorting them even, and there might be a driver and someone else booking appointments, and it can be a quite organized situation. But in the end, you have an individual that's being forced to provide those services, and they're not choosing their clients. They're not choosing what activities are engaged, and they're not keeping the funds from that transaction. They all go to the exploiter. So it's quite oftentimes that we can see this happening in the community, and individuals are coerced to go to these appointments, and then they might return to school or to their family. So it can be seemingly invisible, but is definitely happening. So those are the most common forms of exploitation. And now I want to think a little bit about, well, who are the victims then? Here again, I think there's quite a few myths around modern slavery and exploitation. I think people tend to think, this is a problem that happens in other countries, not in the UK, or this is a problem that only happens to gullible people, and I wouldn't fall prey to that. And that's just not the case. So first of all, it can happen to anyone, regardless of their background. We have spoken with victims who have doctorate degrees, who are very educated in their field. Exploiters are very smart and very manipulative, and they will create or find vulnerabilities and kind of put their thumb on it and get someone to do what they want them to do. I think with respect to nationalities, it's definitely not a situation that affects foreign nationals only. Actually, instead, the UK is increasing when we look at demographics of victim population. So when we look at the government statistics, the UK is one of the most common nationalities of victims. And what's really sobering about that, it's in large part because of the children of the minors that are being identified. And that again gets into the criminal exploitation and county lines, which I'll kind of leave to my colleagues from space to discuss a little bit more later on. But I think what's often really important to remember is that it's happening to British nationals as well as foreign nationals, and it's happening to individuals of all ages. Unfortunately, we've had cases where it involves people that are exploited as grandparents into their 60s, 70s, and 80s, as well as children that are under the age of 15. So there's unfortunately not one stereotypical person or type of victim, and we really want to be alert to that reality. So if you're wondering, well, then how do individuals get into the situation in the first place? How does recruitment happen? If it can happen to anyone, what should we be on the lookout for if we're trying to prevent and inform ourselves and our community? So I just want to pause here and take a minute to look at these 4 bullet points and kind of think to yourself, would you go for any of those situations? So hopefully you've had a chance to read through all those. And I would, right? If it's an apprenticeship and you're coming out of university, or your friend says, let's go make money at a job, that's how you might make connections. Or if a family member or friend, said, why don't you come live with me in another country? If it were me, I could practice my French and look after my cousins. I might go for that. Or it would be very common in our culture, if you've been with someone for several months, to go on a trip with them if you're in a romantic partnership. These are all taken from survivor stories of individuals who have worked with Unseen as to actual ways in which they were recruited and ways in which the exploiter initially met them and began to work with them. And so that's just a picture of how clever the recruitment can be and how easy it can be to fall into a situation of exploitation. And then, of course, we know that as the exploiter continues to work with the victim, they can create further vulnerabilities, that as they're coerced to do various forms of labor or sexual activities, either they've identified a vulnerability that pre-exists, or they might create one and then further manipulate it. So we do see situations where victims have learning disabilities. They might have a pre-existing or a cultivated substance abuse problem, where exploiters can sometimes basically ply individuals with drugs and alcohol and get them addicted. We know there's lots of financial control happening within the modern slavery sector as well. And we heard about that a little bit this morning in a different context. Here, we see as well exploiters will control the money and not pay them what they're due, and that can become a vulnerability. We also see recruitment happening around homeless shelters, where exploiters are explicitly going and looking for individuals who might be homeless or looking for accommodation, and then offer them that accommodation and a job in one, and then we don't hear from them or see them again for a while because they're put to work and kept in a remote location. We also see exploiters quite savvy with using different cultural norms or beliefs. And of course, the result of that trauma can be one of immense shame. So somewhat similar to what we heard before, there can be threats to post or expose intimate pictures or videos in order to get someone to continue to do what they are asking them to do. I've already mentioned a threat to perhaps that they might face prison, but another thing that we see is vulnerability around immigration status. So if it's an individual who isn't supposed to be working in the UK at all because they don't have the right to work, someone can say, well, you don't have the right to work and you're going to be deported back to another situation that's also not good for you. And so you should just be quiet and be thankful for the few pounds I'm giving you an hour. And that doesn't change the fact, of course, that it's exploitative under UK law. And then we see language barriers as a constant vulnerability, both with respect to how someone might come into a situation of exploitation, but also, of course, with them being able to reach out and get service. So that's just a little bit around the way vulnerabilities can be used both to kind of recruit and exploit someone, but then also about how kind of they can keep them in a situation. So I've already mentioned a little bit about how it can cause trauma, of course, a situation of exploitation. And I wanted to spend a couple of minutes thinking about that trauma, because I think when we think about safeguarding and responding in a victim-centered way, it's really important that we're, of course, trauma-informed and can put that in context. And as full disclosure, we could spend years talking about trauma. Dissertations are written, of course, about the impact of trauma. But I think when we see responses go poorly is when kind of what we've heard a bit about today as well, when victims aren't identified or they're not taken seriously, or someone assumes they're not credible. And in reality, the way they're presenting is textbook in line with the way someone would present had they endured the trauma that they're claiming they've endured. And so I think remaining really non-judgmental when we're interacting with victims is so key, even if we might frankly be a little frustrated if they're not forthcoming with their experience, or we're not able to help them in the way that we might want. It's important to show a lot of patience. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the way we can respond in victim-centered ways. But one way we really think about on Unseen how to remain non-judgmental is to make sure that we view trauma and the way trauma manifests as normal responses to abnormal situations. That it's not someone trying to be difficult. It's not someone trying to test us and really see if they just don't want to work with us. They are manifesting very normal symptomatic displays of the effect of trauma, and sometimes beyond their control. And we all know in our lives, of course, stress affects us differently, but we would feel it in our bodies, whether you get a stomach ulcer or tight shoulders, or you grind your teeth. It affects victims and humans emotionally. So we see some that might be quite depressed. We see some that might kind of flatline and not show much emotion because that's their coping skill. It's worked for them. And then we'll see some that are in moments of crisis and they're very upset and they might be crying when they're working with us. And that's fine as well. Of course, we have emotional reactions. Psychological ones are also important to remember because this can specifically affect the way they can engage. So we might be asking them a question and they are actually having trouble remembering what we asked them. So again, it's not that they're trying to thwart the interview, it's that they're having intrusive thoughts, that it is difficult for them to sometimes maintain attention. And again, that can be a very normal response to having endured the types of trauma that we're discussing. And if you think about severe forms of exploitation or any type, if you've got someone who feels out of control with where they live or what they're being made to do, if they feel dehumanized and disempowered, if you have someone that's a victim of sexual exploitation and they literally have not had a good night's sleep for years, and when they hear footsteps, they think someone's going to be coming in to assault them or they're going to be forced to engage in sexual activity, you can see how that would really affect someone. And so survivors cope and can manage to survive that. And we've seen amazing, strong survivors, but the trauma will affect them. And it's important for us to be able to kind of counter that and understand it when we engage with them. Another, I think, common misstep we sometimes make in the professional community is assuming that if someone is in one of these dire situations, that they would get help. And we might think, well, if we were in the situation, we would surely ask for help and we would trust someone like ourselves in our official capacity. But the problem is some of what I've already mentioned, they've kind of been programmed, if you will. I don't really love that word, but they've already been convinced that they can't trust anyone. And also, in the context of this victim, everyone perhaps they've ever known or trusted has betrayed them and turned on them. So it might be difficult for them to trust a stranger who's saying, no, I can help you, tell me your story, even though it's difficult to talk about and it's difficult to disclose. But also, if the form of control is a threat of further violence or a threat to a loved one, if they're individuals at risk that we can't even see in front of us, if someone's sitting in our office and they're not telling us the full story, but we suspect there might be some other things happening in the background. If their loved one who's in another city or country is being threatened, they're going to be very timid perhaps to share their story. And that is, again, very normal. And so I think if we jump and think, well, they rejected the offer of help, or they didn't escape as soon as they could, or actually they're saying they're fine where they are, they don't want to leave, that doesn't mean it's necessarily not a situation of modern slavery. It still could be. We see that a lot, that last point on the helpline, where I work, which I'll share in a little bit, about individuals might say, well, I was homeless before, I've got a roof over my head, sure, I'm not being paid national minimum wage, but I've got a few quid and they're feeding me, and like, this is my system, don't mess with it. Again, that doesn't mean they're not under someone's control. Or we've seen individuals, sometimes with learning disabilities or otherwise, who feel quite loyal to their exploiter. And that's another impact from the trauma, as I mentioned before, that trauma bonding, where they feel valued. The exploiters are smart. We've seen situations where someone was made to work in really bad accommodations, even beaten and living in really poor accommodations, and yet he felt very special to the exploiters. And he said, you know what, they tell me I'm their best worker and they can count on me and they call me son and I'm important to them. And so that sense of belonging or appreciation is one of the ways that the exploiters have kind of kept him tethered and doing their bidding and their work for them. And that often we see in county lines and criminal exploitation as well. Initially, it might be that a young person wants to feel like they belong, and then, you know, it can become quite violent, which I'm sure we'll hear about further in a bit. So when someone might begin to disclose, or when we're interacting with them in our professional capacity, sometimes we might kind of put them in one of these three buckets in our mind. We might think, well, this is the sympathetic victim over here. This is one we can help easily because they're kind of mild and they answer all of our questions and they're telling us upfront what's happening and they're very coherent. Their story matches up. It's going linearly. And we kind of just tend to give them a bit more credibility in our mind, when that's not always the way individuals will present. And then we have other times where we might think, oh, this is a troublemaker victim because they're just uncooperative. They're not working with me. They're being really difficult. And that's an unfortunate way to view that situation. And I fear that it will make us more judgmental if we view them as being a troublemaker or difficult victim. It could be that it's a challenging conversation and it's a hard case, but instead it helps to frame it in the way of they have gone through something really difficult and they themselves are challenged, and it is difficult to talk about what we're asking them to talk about, and maybe difficult for them to build that trust. And then there's the non-credible survivor, where we assume, oh, they're telling us things out of order, or they told the police this, but they told me this. And then we assume that either they're making it up, or it's not entirely all true, or they're trying to game the system. And again, that's a real unfortunate misperception, because oftentimes victims, as a result of their trauma, won't disclose chronologically, and they'll disclose different bits when they're able to identify it themselves or ready to talk about it with that person. And so you can see now perhaps why I have that image of the iceberg. I love this image because I think when we encounter a potential victim of exploitation, we expect and kind of only see a very small percentage of what's really happening. And there could be all kinds of trauma and coping and survival skills that person has built up under the surface. And we need to be aware that we can't see the full picture right away, and to be very gracious and give them time. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we might help them and empower them to disclose and build trust. So before I start talking a little bit more about kind of how can we respond and more of the resources available in the UK and how we do respond to modern slavery, I wanted to share a little bit more about the context of my particular work. I kind of jumped right into the issue so we could get to grips with modern slavery. But I'm from a charity called Unseen. We've been working in the sector for about 15 years now. We run a safe house for men and a safe house for women. We also run several outreach programs which provide support to members in the community who might not be living in a safe house but still need various forms of support, whether it's finding a job or language skills or help with their asylum claims, or reintegrating into society. We also work at a policy level with government and several different working groups to really try to influence both the law, and have been a part of several different initiatives in the past, as well as different practices and regulations that can be in place. And then we also run the Modern Slavery Helpline. So I'm going to share a little bit more about that particularly because I think it's quite a key resource in the UK and to ourselves who are in frontline professions. So to dig in more to the helpline, it is, first of all, free. So anybody can call at any time. It's an 08000 number. You don't at all on your phone. We often get that question several times over. People want to make sure that they don't need anything, and they don't. It's 24/7. So unfortunately, exploitation happens, of course, around the clock, and we frankly invest quite a lot of effort to be open all the time and have facilitated some removals or extractions on major public holidays. Because we, again, think that's a more victim-centered way to respond as well, that as soon as that individual has a moment where they feel safe and ready to speak to someone, we want to be there. We are confidential and completely independent from the government or any agency, completely operated by Unseen the charity. That's very important. So someone can call and not even tell us their name, and we'll fully engage with them and offer them all this emotional support and safety planning and describe all of the options available to them. And we might never know who they are, and that's fine. Or they can tell us who they are and they don't want us to tell anyone else. That's fine. We consider that, again, part of our victim-centered approach, that we kind of take it at the pace that the person's willing to disclose. We offer translation in over 200 languages, and that's important because we want to make sure people are comfortable and able to disclose in the way that best suits them, if English is not their preferred language. Our team go through 4 to 5 weeks of training before they ever answer a call. And I think that's important because modern slavery situations can be really complex, and the different indicators can come up in different ways. And again, how you surface and offer call skills to the different ways trauma has affected someone can be really tricky. So we really spend a lot of time getting ourselves ready and keeping our expertise up to snuff. We get calls, as you might have assumed as I've been speaking, from victims themselves that are actually in situations of exploitation and are considering leaving or trying to better understand exactly what's happening to them and what their options might be if they were to get out of the situation. We also get calls from members of the public who have seen something and they're not sure what it is, but they think it might be exploitative or modern slavery. So they might have visited a takeaway and they thought that the person wasn't being treated properly, and then they noticed perhaps that they were sleeping on site, and that would be really key information to pass on. Or they've talked to someone who's disclosed. And then also of note for this session as well, we get a substantial amount of calls from statutory agencies and public professionals and offer quite a lot of technical assistance. So we get calls from, of course, nurses and physicians. We get calls from local authority officers, from police officers, from job centers and DWP, from solicitors, particularly increasingly recently around criminal exploitation. And we welcome those and want to serve that population as well, because again, we're all trying to support the victims and collaborate. So then what happens when someone calls into the helpline? Well, it's our policy to refer all cases to the police if a crime's been reported. But again, within our confidentiality and victim-centeredness, we actually have a huge caveat there. So if it's an adult victim who is not ready to interact with officials and doesn't want us to pass it on, then we won't. And that's really important because we think that the victim is the expert in their own story, and we want to take it at their pace. And ultimately, we don't want to unintentionally cause further harm. And if we refer and they're not ready to disclose, worst case scenario, a well-intended official or safeguarding official or police officer can visit that person and they'll say everything's fine. There's no problem here, because of course the exploiters may be looking at them and they fear that retaliation. And then that official leaves and the victim can be at increased risk and suffer significant retaliation. So we want to make sure that if we're interacting with a victim, they're ready to engage with different individuals that might be involved if that's the route they want to take. And then we also really invest quite a lot in data. I'm not going to talk a lot about data, but that's a key part of what we do, trying to build up the knowledge base around modern slavery. So we have monthly and quarterly and yearly reports, and we often sometimes give bespoke reports to different localities when awareness campaigns are running. So if you wanted to know more about what's happening in your particular area, you could get in touch and we could talk about options there. So the helpline's been in operation about 5 years. So just a quick kind of snapshot of kind of the scale of what we're talking about. As you can see, we've had over 60,000 contacts. That's indicated over 25,000 cases of modern slavery or exploitation, and that has indicated, 8,000 cases of modern slavery, and that's indicated 24,000 victims. So it's a significant amount that's coming through the helpline already, and of course we're continuing to operate even right now. We also have an app. It's another resource available to anyone and everyone. It's free. You can download it today. One thing I really like about the app is it kind of serves as a little pocket guide. So if you forget everything I've said today, there's still some great information in there, and you can see the different types of exploitation are listed and the different things you might want to look out for, and it points you straight through to our a reporting form. So if someone filled out the form on the app, that would come straight through to the helpline, and we could get back in touch with you and offer a bit of support. And that's for, again, use in professional or personal capacities. So if you're thinking, okay, well, it's happening all over the place, anyone can be recruited, it's happening to any sort of person, we're kind of in denial, I think, as a community about how frequent it is. You might be thinking, well, where can victims be identified? This is a list of the different places in which victims have been identified across the UK. So again, these are access points. This isn't necessarily where they were exploited, although it might be, but they're also places in which they've been able to share their story and been identified and get help. And so I like this slide mainly because it shows you how it's everywhere. You might see a victim anywhere. And I think I personally think that it is not a matter of if you ever encounter or deal with a situation of modern slavery. I think it is only a matter of when you deal with a situation of modern slavery in your personal or professional life. It is just that prevalent, unfortunately. So I want to talk now a little bit about, okay, well, if we do interact or suspect a situation of exploitation, some of those indicators and in one of those locations, then what's available to them and how to respond. So really briefly, the national referral mechanism is the primary way in which adult victims can receive support. So this is a government-funded system that's used to identify and support adult victims. As well, children are also identified in this way. However, adult victims receive actual services through the NRM. We could get into the depths of kind of the different stages of decisions and how this proceeds. I think that on the surface, a few key things to know is that it is temporary. The NRM isn't long-term services. It's not really designed to be. So initially you apply and there's kind of a 5-day wait until you know whether you're going to be eligible for the NRM and the services. And then once you are eligible, you have 45 days where you might be provided accommodation, or if it's an outreach, you might be given access to other services, as you can see there, like counseling or financial guidance or legal advice. And then at the end of that time, there is a body called a single competent authority, which is a branch of the Home Office, basically, who then review that case, and there will be an official letter sent to the victim to say, yes, the government identifies you as a victim of modern slavery or not. And if they are identified, they could get another 45 days of support. And then when exiting care, there's some other processes to look at, kind of what are their ongoing needs and how can they be moving on to other services in the community. And there's quite a big push to move those individuals to local authority support as soon as possible if they're eligible. So again, very relevant to know how this will be coming up in the communities, even if someone's already been removed from the situation and received support. There can be some real long-term needs, and that's something we see a lot of on the helpline. But what's really important as well is to know that victims cannot self-refer into the NRM. It's a role called the first responder. First responders roughly include police officers, local authority officers, members of certain bodies like the Gangmasters Labor Abuse Authority, and certain specific NGOs, such as Unseen or in nonprofits that work in this sector. At the moment, all of the NHS is not a first responder. So that flags that if you're in that situation, you would want to be able to work across sector with individuals that are first responders. So there would need to be some collaboration with a local authority officer or a police officer if that's who's closely related. UKVI and immigration enforcement can also act as a first responder if they're already a part of the situation as well. And those individuals will basically fill out an application and submit it so that they can start these services that might include safe housing and everything else listed. I wanted to talk a little bit about other protections in addition to the national referral mechanism, which is a route to kind of services. We also see these others that come up quite often and that are statutorily protected. So the statutory defense is key, particularly as we see criminal exploitation increasing. The statutory defense does not apply to the more severe crimes like homicide or modern slavery itself, but generally for drug trafficking or kind of shoplifting, those situations where we see criminal exploitation most prolific, the statutory defense would apply. And that would mean if someone were charged with drug trafficking, let's say, and they were to say, actually, I'm a victim of modern slavery, I've been coerced to do this, there's it's called Section 45 under the Modern Slavery Act. There's a defense there for them. So it would be important for that person to know about it. There's also special measures available to victim witnesses. It can be very difficult to testify or to participate in these investigations. So if in court, they can have supports such as sharing testimony through a CCTV or from behind a screen. Legal aid is available. Another key thing with respect to children, there's a presumption of age that's actually in the Modern Slavery Act in statute, which is if there's any doubt about whether someone is an adult or not, they should be treated as a child. They should be treated as a minor until a proper age assessment can be conducted. So you don't even have to think about what to do if in doubt. It's there in the statute. There's also child trafficking guardians. Those are operated by Bernardo's, a children's charity, and that is for children who are in the system and have had an NRM go in and they're identified as a victim or they might be a victim. You can call Bernardo's, who's a key source, to offer some support for those children. That's been piloted in different areas and is continuing to roll out across the UK and growing. And then last, I wanted to talk about risk and prevention orders. I really like talking about risk and prevention orders because I think it's one of it's not utilized very much. We're not maximizing this, and it's so creative and kind of broad. So basically, in the Modern Slavery Act, there's the ability, kind of like other protection orders we've already discussed today, if there's a victim or a situation and you think they're at risk of being trafficked or exploited, or there's an exploiter who's already been convicted. Upon conviction, they can be given further orders to basically limit their civil liberties so that they're less likely to traffic or exploit someone again. And I think these can be really helpful if you're looking to safeguard particularly children and communities, and we're thinking about, well, kind of what protections are in place. Risk and prevention orders are good things to think about initially. They can only be applied for by police, so you'd want to be working with a police officer if you're not already, and those applications go to the court, and there needs to be a good case made for it. So kind of what activity are you trying to prevent, and why is that related to the risk? Why is that necessary? So one of those examples might be, you know, if you thought someone was at risk or exploiting someone, there are indicators. You might say they're not allowed, I don't know, on school grounds, or they're not allowed in this location or within the living, like the residential area of the child, for example. And then that would go forward. It might be a way to kind of build a little bit of protection. These are some more things to think about with respect to children. Interestingly, for adults who are considering entering the National Referral Mechanism, the NRM, they have to consent to that. For children, they don't have to consent, and the guidance is very clear that any first responder, so a local authority officer or police officer, should be submitting those NRMs anytime they think a child might be a victim of modern slavery or exploitation. And interestingly, though, I mentioned before, these services are provided for adults through the NRM and other charities that also offer services and have funding to do so outside of the NRM. But the local authorities are still the main body that are responsible for safeguarding and providing care for child victims. Some of you might also know there's some pilots happening around the country of local authorities who are also kind of making the decisions on NRMs, and that's kind of an interim situation where it's been observed but has really shown some really great fruit at kind of quick responsive times. Other than that, of course, we would say follow your normal safeguarding practices, have your investigation meetings, have your strategy meetings. It's always good to work collaboratively and across sector. I mentioned the risk and prevention orders that are helpful. I think remembering how invisible the control can be and how manipulative exploiters can be, it's really wise to think about what is the risk and how can we safety plan if we're looking at moving a child or placing them in another sort of location. And this might be talked about a little bit more today too. Return home interviews are really important if a child goes missing, and the child doesn't need to go missing for 2 days or for 24 hours. If a parent is coming to you and saying they're just gone a little bit in the afternoon and I don't know where they are, or they're gone each evening, and there are other signs perhaps like they have a new burner phone and they have some money, or their mood is changing, or they're showing signs of violence, if these things are all presenting, and particularly I think return home interviews are quite important when they come back, if they've been away for a period of time and they've been missing. And then I think we could discuss more kind of the best school discipline response, but sometimes our typical school discipline responses, if someone is not coming to school, if they've been absent or they're acting out, we might think, oh, well, we'll suspend them or exclude them. But sometimes that plays right into the hands of the exploiter because that's kind of what they want to happen. And then no one's expecting that child to be at school, and then they can send them to do their bidding and exploit them further. So I think we need to look kind of creatively at what's the best response when we think someone is trouble in the classroom. They themselves could be in trouble. These are some of the tips that I would offer as far as how we respond on the helpline, and it's good ways to kind of build trust when we're interacting with victims. So more to kind of have in your toolkit. It does take a lot of patience. It can be difficult. We are all going to be well-intended, of course, and trying to offer support, but every victim is different. Every survivor will recover in their own way, and we want to give them the time and space to do so. And you have to imagine as well, when they're speaking with us, there's quite a big power discrepancy. They might feel embarrassed about what's happening to them. They might feel embarrassed to need help. And so as they begin to disclose, it's really important to try to help empower them as much as we can. And so any way in which we can help them feel in control and offer them choice can be really good. So we can give them choice about whether we talk at all, or whether they answer our questions, or how fast or how long we talk. They can decide when we want to take a break. That in and of itself gives them the power and control to tell their story the way they want, and that's really important. I suggest giving someone a roadmap, because when they come in and maybe are talking to you or beginning to disclose, they might not realize you're going to have a ton of questions and forms to fill out, and then they're going to have to talk to a police officer and whatever else is going to be triggered. So to let them know what might happen is respectful and also further empowers them so they know what's coming their way. Please don't overpromise. We, of course, want to give them the world and give them safety right away. But if you promise something that you yourself cannot guarantee, you risk further jeopardizing that trust and disappointing them and being yet another person in their life who's not followed through. So we at the helpline are very careful to say, we can't promise this. A first responder has to look at this. There's going to be a gap in time here. Like we're very transparent so they know it's coming, and we can work with them carefully. It's really helpful to ask open-ended questions. I think sometimes when we see individuals struggling, we kind of want to help them and kind of put words in their mouth unintentionally and kind of say, oh, do you mean this? But really asking who and what and where and how and when questions encourages them to tell their story. And what happens is we get details and more information than we might have anticipated, which can be really helpful as well. Furthering from that, I've already mentioned how to remain as non-judgmental as possible and to kind of understand that victims aren't going to disclose in a nice, neatly chronological way within 10 minutes that we have between meetings. If you are a first responder and you're making an NRM application, I would please encourage you to make it as complete as possible. And by that, I mean, include all of the indicators of modern slavery that you've seen or that you've identified with this person. That NRM application is really important. And the first decision as to whether they get services for that first block of time is often solely on the NRM application itself. So please don't think they're automatically going to get an interview and a chance to tell their story. If they're telling you and you've identified indications of modern slavery, include it on that form. I think the setting for that conversation is also so important. Again, they're going to feel perhaps disempowered or nervous. So if you can make it comfortable, even if they're under bright lights and at a table, they're already going to be kind of on edge. So a better setting is helpful. If you are going to be intervening in the situation in your official capacity, sometimes it's really, I've already mentioned, kind of working with the victim as to what they're ready for. Sometimes discreet interventions can really go a long way. Unfortunately, on the helpline, we've seen situations where a report was made and someone went in and they're like, oh, it's fine. We asked them. They said they're fine. And I'm like, oh, goodness. But you asked them in their workplace or in their residence. And there's so much more that needs to be considered. Like, did you pull them away from the exploiter? And that's a huge recommendation, is to pull someone away from the exploiter. So that's the point here about what frontline professionals can do on the second bullet point there. Can you take them away from the place of exploitation and away from the exploiter? And by away, I mean out of earshot and out of eyesight. If they can still be seen, if they still feel pressure, that can be really difficult for them. Please get an independent translator. We have so many cases, sometimes particularly in hospitals, where it feels like, well, they say they're their cousin and they're translating. If you have any inclination that it's not a good situation, I would encourage you to get an independent trusted translator and remove that victim from the exploiter and have a chance to talk to them. Maybe everything is fine, but letting someone else translate is very risky. Keeping the victim updated as to kind of what you're going to do and what you suspect is really important, as well as following through. And then, of course, you can offer them helpline literature. So maybe they don't fully disclose to you right up front, but you suspect there could be a concern. Feel free to pass on our number to them. We have posters we can share. They can be up and around your facilities, and then they can call us. So again, we're a resource. The helpline's here to help. We'll offer you technical support in your professional capacity. Victims themselves can call us anytime, and we will help them if they're not ready to leave. We'll offer some pretty bespoke safety planning or emotional support, and we can also talk through the NRM and the processes and what might be available to them. And then if you want more in-depth training, and we could talk about this much more around modern slavery, we're happy to work with you and provide more of those awareness materials and data, as I mentioned. I'll skip the case study because I'm out of time and I want to make sure we share a bit of time for questions.
Thank you, Rachel. That's fantastic. Take a breather.
And I get excited, and then I just start going.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. We've got only 5 minutes, and I believe we've got a few questions. So I'm going to hand straight over to Stacey, and we'll just see what we can do. But if you can be as quick as you can answering, then hopefully we can get through them all. So thank you so much.
Hi, Rachel. Okay, so the first question. So why do you think risk and prevention orders are not used? I would say it's been quite difficult within my local authority to promote use of the Home Office disruption toolkit, and not sure how to remedy this.
I think first off, sometimes people don't even know about them. So I think there's a lack of awareness. And then I think if they do know about them, they might not realize how wide or vague they can be, meaning how creative you can be about what you want to restrict. Or they think they're going to have to prove quite a lot in order to get one in place. So the actual rules around it is that it needs to be reasonable and proportionate and connected to the situation. And then I think another, maybe it can be seen, I don't know exactly what's happening in your situation, is that you do need the police to be involved, and they need to make that request. When they first came out, I did a training with magistrate judges, and they had never heard of them, and yet they were supposed to be the ones issuing them. So I do think that the sector's kind of been a little bit slow, but even once aware, I think that it's a little bit about creativity, but keep pushing. I'm so glad to know that you know about them, of course, and you're trying to use them. I think we're just not used to them yet, or enforcing them. It takes good collaboration from police.
Thank you. Thanks for your presentation. My question is, during and since COVID, has there been any changes in how modern slavery is played out, or any new trends?
Yes, I mean, in 2020, labor exploitation decreased on the helpline, as we would expect, I think, with, different sectors being shut down or not in operation. But interestingly, even during the pandemic, we saw fewer calls than normal as people weren't out and about observing the communities as much. But we actually saw a rise in sexual exploitation and criminal exploitation, and a slight rise in domestic servitude as well. So it's definitely still happening. I think another issue is we're beginning to look at how kind of COVID protection and proper social distancing can actually be another risk and a sign of labor abuse or exploitation as well. As far as the sectors, we did see a little shift in the sectors of labor exploitation, so more towards construction and logistics, and a bit fewer in like car washes and nail bars. But again, those locations weren't to be opened. So kind of a little bit what you would expect. So it definitely made an impact, but in short, it's continued, and I'd say the worst case scenario is it's continuing at the same rate, if not more. We're just not out and about to see it as much.
Thank you. And how would you advise to approach concerns if someone does feel like they're being exploited, or you feel that they're not being honest about what is happening?
Yeah, if you think they're not being honest, I think one key thing you can offer is safety planning. And we do that on the helpline all the time. And we say, okay, well, it sounds like things are fine now, but if the situation got worse or if it's escalated, just so you know, I'd like to chat through some options. Or, you can say, I'm a bit worried about your safety. There's some risks here. Could we chat through how to respond to it? And generally people will listen. And because if you kind of put it under that umbrella of like, you might not feel that you need this now, but this could be helpful in the future. And then we see callers call us back, and then they're like, oh, it's gotten worse. I do need help, and I am ready to work with police, and I do want all those services you talked about. So I think even laying the groundwork before someone's ready, giving them that information is really empowering and helpful, that they know that there are services and how they could leave, because if they don't know that, they might think they have no other option, and that can further make them feel bound to the situation.
Lovely, thank you. And have you heard of any innovative ways of getting young people to engage when at risk or with a positive NRM?
Thankfully, I don't have to talk about it too much because I have a feeling that the next presenter can also talk about that. But I think one thing that actually works for adults as well is I don't think it's helpful to hide the ball. Sometimes I think that we don't want to tell children everything, or our concerns, or that we're going to go tell or talk to the school. And I don't think that that's really helpful. I think being more transparent about the risks and what's happening and what we're going to do with it is more respectful and more likely to garner the trust of the child. So that's one thing I would offer.
Thank you so much, Rachel. We got there.